Okay, so let's start with the third session of this morning and with a new chapter, chapter 1, in which we will see how after the Second World War new ideas popped up regarding deeper collaboration on the European continent, how this was linked with worldwide developments and also with the results of the Second World War, and more precisely, on the one hand, the Cold War, how not only the European continent, but also even the world was divided in two big ideological and political camps, characterized by, on the one hand, communism, command economies, and on the other hand, democracy, liberal ideas regarding organizing the economy and society, welfare states. This is in a nutshell at the beginning of the first part of this first chapter, and we will also see how more and more international collaboration became important, referring to United Nations, but also how the United States of America tried to help European countries and nation states to bring back democracy and organize an economic recovery, and also support the European continent in securing their safety regarding the threat that came from the Soviet Union and its allies, countries in Eastern and Central Europe. And that's a bit, you could say, the table of contents and the issues that are part of this first chapter. And again, we have to refer to the Second World War. We will not deal with details about it. That's not our interest. But the end of the Second World War, also implied the start of a new war. But I think the Cold War, as I mentioned already, the tensions between the East and the West, between the communist world and the more liberal, capitalistic-oriented world, and also the appearance of the Iron Curtain that divided physically even the European countries. And for the first time, in fact, that word or that concept of the Iron Curtain it was mentioned in a speech by the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in Fulton, Missouri, 1946. Churchill referred to that Iron Curtain and that a clear division, new division on the European continent. He mentioned from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. I am convinced there is nothing they, meaning the communists, so much admire as strength, and there is nothing for which they have less respect than weakness, especially military weakness. It could have been a speech given yesterday, maybe, regarding what is happening nowadays on the European continent. Don't forget that Winston Churchill was not anymore Prime Minister of Great Britain in 1946. Winston Churchill was one of the big politicians during the Second World War, and surprisingly, Churchill and his party, the Tories, they lost the first elections after the Second World War. and in Britain, a Labour government came into power after that First World War, which did not mean that Churchill could not play any more an important political role after the war, but that was a surprise. It gave him also more freedom to speech. From time to time, after the Second World War, Winston Churchill became apparently an advocate of European integration. And he even also talked about a United States of Europe. He would not have done that in the same words, in the same language, if he still was a prime minister of Great Britain. And so also the position you have has an impact on what you say or not. And just to mention that. But end of the war, start of the Cold War, and it had an enormous impact on the political, economic, social situation of the European continent. And this had an impact on the start of the European integration project after some years. And I think what I'm going to say now will be nothing new for you. It was the West against the East, capitalism versus communism, not only on the European continent, but in fact even worldwide. The West and the East try to bring other countries or groups in their influence sphere, especially also after that important process of decolonization that immediately started after the Second World War. Between 1945 and 1960, the majority of the colonial territories became independent, starting, for instance, with India, 1960. Then I always refer to the independence of the Belgian Congo. And all this happened within a fast-changing world, but also, importantly, to have that in mind in the context of increasing rivalry between the East and the West. And almost all countries had to choose a side. Okay, so Eastern Europe, what we see is that after the Second World War, in the beginning, there were more or less democratic governments. Elections were organized, even in these countries and territories that were liberated by the Soviet Army, by the Red Army. But after a while, already soon, you saw that the impact of Moscow became more and more important, and that the Communist Party started with the installation of communist governments in these Eastern and Central European countries, with a huge impact on civil society, on the economy. For instance, the seizing of private property, and that idea of a collective organized society, a collective organized economy was imposed on most of these countries. Governments directed to a large extent by Moscow started with a planned economy, with a command economy, and with 4-5 years plan. Was that new? No, because the Soviet Union already started with this kind of economic policy before the Second World War. And in fact, also many European countries did that in the course of the 1930s, because they thought that this was a new way to combat the economic recession of the 1930s, and that the government had to be more involved in the economy, that the government, had to become more involved in the economy and had to work with a more planned policy, with 4 or 5 year economic policy plans. Nazi Germany did the same, in fact. It's not for this course. I think But it's very interesting to compare the economic policy of the Nazi regime in the 1930s in Germany with the communist economic policy in the same period. There are much more similarities than differences. Anyway, so that is what's happening in Eastern Europe, but I think you know that. Western Europe was much more oriented towards the United States, was liberated by Allied forces, by Americans, but also Canadians, you name it, but looked at the United States for guidance, for help, for support. The United States that played an enormous role, important role in setting up a new international organizations together with Britain, with France, but especially with Britain, and that special relationship between Britain and the United States, something complete, that's for the future, I think, was very important. And it still even is today, that special relationship. We can start discussing the Brexit, but also in that context, it played a role. And so Western Europe was more and more under the influence sphere of the United States, looked at the United States for support. I will come back to that later, maybe this morning, and with the Marshall Plan. I guess you heard about that already. But also for international guidance. Look to the United States for support regarding economic recovery, oriented and organized and from the principles of economic liberalism, free trade, competitiveness, supporting market integration, and then we can refer to free trade, to liberalizing financial flows, capital markets, and the Marshall Plan, very important from an economic perspective for European countries. Also looked to the United States for guidance towards political stability. And the big question after the Second World War was, what kind of relationship shall we build with West Germany? Germany was divided in two after the war. The East was liberated by the Red Army and became East Germany under the influence sphere of Moscow, and West Germany liberated by American, French, and British soldiers mainly, became a democratic country. But how to cope with that new West Germany? In the same way as European countries did in 1919, to punish them again very hard for the outbreak of the Second World War? Or was it better to do it now in another way? Were there lessons learned from the First World War? That was the big question. I'll come back to that later also this morning. And then, of course, military security and the threat from the Soviet Union, the threat from East Germany and other Central and Eastern European countries. Former allies, but immediately after the Second World War, the tensions started to increase between the East and the West. And how to organize that military security. And you know that also, 1949, and NATO was founded as a transatlantic organization to secure peace, but also to secure the Western European countries. So that's a bit the situation immediately after the Second World War. What you see is that, a lot of Europeans believed that after the war it was necessary to collaborate much more, and that was also one of the lessons learned. 1930s, political problems, economic problems, each country on its own, more or less, protectionism. That's why after the Second World War there was a lot of enthusiasm for collaboration, on an international level, but also on European continent. But the big question was how to organize this, with which countries, in which concept. To give you one example, on European continent, already in 44, 45, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg started with talks to integrate their economy, and because they thought that they were too small to compete in a post-World War situation with the big European countries. So let's try to integrate one way or another our economy. That was not really successful, but it's an example of how the mind shift happened at the time. The big question was how to organize this, with which countries, under which concept. And then the big question, as always, intergovernmental or supranational. What is the concept? Shall we give some part of our autonomy to a new international organization, or is that a step too far? And that will be for the next decades one of the big questions in European integration. Shall we collaborate on an intergovernmental level so that each country can have decision power still on a governmental level? Or shall we go for a supranational approach, which means that nation states give a part of their power to an international organization in which they have to share their sovereignty, their autonomy with other countries? And that's the big question that will continue the next decades and even today. Within the context of the European Union. Okay, so more context information, but I can go quick here, I think. Germany was defeated, you know that, big surprise, divided in 4 zones of occupation, and that made West and East Germany. I have a map somewhere. And also here you see that Iron Curtain. Oops. I'm not used to work with, I'm old-fashioned, you know. And you see European continent, here the red line is the Iron Curtain, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste, Mediterranean. And you see the East, the West, Western Bloc, Communist Bloc, or the Soviet zone. Some countries that remained neutral, you could say to some extent. Allied countries in the north, like Sweden, Finland, also Spain mainly because of its specific situation after the Second World War, already before the Second World War. It was an authoritarian regime, the Franco regime, and so was not part of that international alliance. Also Ireland, and also Switzerland remained neutral, and for them that was very, very important. But also here you see how Germany after the Second World War was divided. Here, West Germany, and in fact, after the Second World War, there was an allied governance system over Germany. And West Germany was divided in 3 zones, in fact 4 zones. You had a Soviet zone in the east, and then the British, the French, and the American zone in the west. Berlin was a specific situation, was in fact an island in the Soviet zone, and Berlin in itself was also divided in 4 occupation zones, in the east a Soviet zone, and then in the West, and also a French, a British, and an American occupation zone. And the idea was that the Allies would manage Germany and would coordinate a policy in Germany immediately after the Second World War. And in fact, to find solutions for the big problems at the European continent, and in this case, Germany witnessed and struggled with after the Second World War. Huge economic challenges, and the country was in ruin. A lot of unemployment, scarcity in resources, consumer goods, lack of food to start with, lack of housing, big challenges, and high prices, high inflation. The country had to be rebuilt politically, socially, economically, and how to do that in a better way than after the First World War. A flourishing black market, for instance. We cannot imagine the challenges the country had at the time. To give you one personal anecdote, my father, he was a member of the Belgian army in 45, 46, who occupied, in fact, a specific zone in Germany. And he always said, I could buy everything with one cigarette. Just to mention how the black market economy was so important, and people didn't have anything in Germany. And with one cigarette, a bar of chocolate, an orange, you could do everything in Germany in these first months after the war. There was also a lot of problems with refugees. A lot of Germans fled for the Red Army, and they did not want to live in a region occupied by the Soviet Union, by the Red Army. And so that's why they moved to West Germany. But that implied that the demand for food, for clothes, for sheltering, for jobs even became higher and more problematic. So I think it's important just to understand the economic challenges and political challenges Germany witnessed immediately after the Second World War. At the same time, Western Europe could start more or less immediately with its economic recovery. Not all at the same time, because some countries were liberated earlier than other countries. Some countries were much more damaged, you could say, had witnessed a higher economic impact, industrial impact, because of the war, and that also had an impact on the economic recovery. And to give you one example, Belgium had a fast and a quick economic recovery after the liberation in 1944. And that was mainly because of the two most important ports of Belgium, Ghent and Antwerp, did not witness a lot of destruction during the war, which meant that after liberation, rather immediately, they operated as before the war and became important hubs for the Allied forces to bring in troops to the European continent, but also all kinds of military equipment and consumer goods. So especially in 1945, 46, 47, 48, the Belgian economic recovery was very fast and very impressive. And that had an important impact on employment, on industrial investments, even purchasing power of the Belgian population. It's a detail maybe, but at that moment, Belgium became a country or an economy characterized by high wages. Before the Second World War, the Belgian industrial economy and its success was based on low wages. And that changed after the Second World War, and because the transport infrastructure, but also mainly the industrial infrastructure, the heavy industry, the coal mines in the southern part of the country, could start immediately again functioning after the liberation, because there was no real destruction or no important destruction after the Second World War. So Belgium was in the first years after the Second World War very often called an industrial miracle. But at the end of that decade, at the end of the 1940s, the beginning of the 1950s, Belgium became the sick man of Western Europe because of the fact that wages were high and trade unions had demanded that immediately after the Second World War. And also because of the fact that Belgian companies did not invest a lot in their economy and their industry after the war. And what they wanted to do from 44, 45 onwards was producing as quick as possible because the demand was high from other countries regarding iron, metal, coal, you name it. But after a while, also other countries on the European continent started with their economic recovery, and they did it maybe in a better way, slower, but most importantly, using modern technology, state-of-the-art technology, meaning that around 1950, the Belgian industry became outdated, and other countries at that moment were functioning again, their industry, based on state-of-the-art technology. So why do I say this? Because the economic recovery in Western Europe was not everywhere the same. In some countries it started early and in an important way. In other countries, rather gradually. Other countries struggled with the industrial and economic recovery, and they struggled with it for decades. And I think France and Italy are two good examples of countries, in general, very important economies, but who coped with a lot of problems and challenges in the 1950s, 1960s, had to modernize their old industry. Also countries, especially Italy, and with big economic differences between the North and the South, which will also be an issue in the history of European integration. You have big economic differences between countries, but you also have big economic differences within countries, not only in Italy, of course. You have the same in Britain, you have the same in Belgium between the North and the South. But how to deal with that? What kind of economic policy do you want to develop in common? And that makes it very, very complicated. But we'll come back to that later also. And then the Soviet Union, I already referred to it. You know that the Red Army liberated East and Central Europe. And after a while, communist regimes were installed, and the democratic coalition governments that were initially in power, they were set aside, and gradually Eastern and Central Europe became satellite states of the Soviet Union of Moscow. And it was this development in 45, 46, 47 that shift from rather democratic coalition governments in the East towards satellite states of the Soviet Union that, of course, enforced the mistrust and the distrust between the East and the West. And although there were already tensions during the Second World War between, let's say, the United States and Britain and France and the Soviet Union, these tensions increased a lot after the Second World War. And that had to do with these political developments, also with the race for the first atomic bomb and atomic nuclear technology, and also the fact that in 1945 the American President Roosevelt died, and Roosevelt, although he did not trust Stalin, he always had hoped for, let's say, a rather good collaboration between the United States and the West and the Soviet Union. But the successor of Roosevelt, Truman, he was more strict in his strategy towards the Soviet Union. And he, in fact, wanted to contain the Soviet Union and the ideology. And that's also one of the reasons why the United States in 45, 46 wanted to support the economic recovery of the European continent, or at least of the Western European countries, not only to improve the economy, but also as a block regarding the communist threat. And that is when the Marshall Plan was born. Okay, what can we say about the United States? I think more powerful than ever after the Second World War. Second World War had, of course, a huge impact on the economy in the United States. In fact, the United States struggled with a major economic crisis from 1929 onwards. In fact, the first big economic crisis, you could say, in the history of the United States. Let's say from second half of the 19th century, the economy in the United States was continuously growing, profited, as I said before, from the First World War situation, but with the crash in 1929, stock market in New York, and all the problems linked to that, in the 1930s, United States witnessed a huge economic problem and recession, and with high unemployment figures, and even high inflation, etc., etc. And that recession only stopped, according to many economic historians, when the United States entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And very successfully, the United States succeeded in transforming its economy from a normal economy to a war economy. And that resulted in fast diminishing unemployment figures, and also in changing the industrial infrastructure. And that technological and industrial capacity had, of course, an enormous impact on the war. The United States could produce an enormous number of tanks, of planes, warships, etc., that Germany and its allies could not follow. And also, the number, the size of the population played an enormous role. And so that implied that United States, also as one of the big victorious countries of the war, became powerful, more powerful than ever, with important post-war ambitions, new ambitions. Before the Second World War, not that much interested in the international political developments. After the Second World War, the United States decided to be not only, you cannot decide to be the economic #1 of the world, but also wanted to be the political leader of the world, and to guide the free world and towards a brighter future based on liberal economic ideas, free trade, free flow of capital, of investments, but based on an international network of international organizations. And I already referred to them at the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, international trade agreements, which in the end resulted in the GATT agreements, and we will discuss them also later this semester, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and trying to stimulate the world, the Western world, towards more intense economic collaboration, free trade, free flow of capital, mutual help, etc., etc., and in the end, limited protectionist policy measures. As I said before, initially, the American government, the Roosevelt administration, had the ambition, the intention to cooperate with the Soviet Union as much as possible. But an important change maker was the death of Roosevelt. And Truman was more aggressive, more strict in his opinion towards the Soviet Union. And he developed that containment policy. And a part of that containment policy on the European continent was the Marshall Plan and the atomic bomb. But you know that from the Oppenheimer movie, I think. There's also a very interesting comic made on Oppenheimer and the atomic bomb, but I'm not sure there are comic lovers in the classroom. Not at all? Oh, okay. Anyway, post-war politics in Western Europe. And what can we say about that? Communists became increasingly popular. That's maybe also a question for you. Western Europe, communists are popular after the Second World War. How must we understand that? Why? Why were communists receiving more and more support after the Second World War?
Their policy was to
Yeah, that collective idea. Yeah. Okay, that I think that to some extent that made the communist ideology appealing. Yeah, so they were successful. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, the influence of the Soviet Union helping bringing down Germany.
Yeah.
So people saw another side of the
Okay.
available.
Yeah. Other explanations. What made them popular? Maybe already before the war and also during the war. I think the success, or in the end, the success of the Red Army, because in the beginning of the war it was not so successful. It only changed after Stalingrad. I think one of the reasons why the Communist Party became popular in Western European countries was because of the communist resistance also during the war. In many countries, the resistance was important, and you had all kinds of resistance groups. But for instance, in France, in the Netherlands, but also in Belgium, also in Italy, the resistance that came out from the Communist Party that already existed before the war, it was very successful and very powerful. And that played a role after the Second World War, because out of that communist resistance, new communist parties were organized. And people said, what you referred to, Communist Army was successful. There was that collective idea linked to the communist ideology. And I think also an important element we may not forget is that in the 1930s, democracy was not so successful. European countries struggled with economic recession. European democracies could not prevent the outbreak of the Second World War. And so some people thought maybe we must opt for another political system, for another economic system, because the capitalist system in the 1930s collapsed, you could say, because of the major worldwide economic crisis. So a lot of people did not believe anymore in that idea of democracy and the capitalist recipes. And that already fueled the communist parties and communist support in the 1930s, link that to the communist success of the World War, the resistance, the Red Army, etc. So all this had an impact on increasing communist popularity in Western European countries. So we may not forget that. Today, communist parties are not that important anymore. However, in Belgium, the new Communist Party or the renewed Communist Party attracts again more and more support, but that has mainly to do with more populism, I think, and with more and more people who do not believe anymore in politics. But maybe that was a bit the same in the 1930s and immediately after the Second World War. So communists were an important political ideology and political group after the Second World War. Social Democrats and also the Christian Democrats. I think in the majority of European countries, the Liberal Party after the Second World War was in fact a small party. And the coalition governments that were organized and installed after the Second World War were very often a combination of Social Democrats, Christian Democrats, and then sometimes with the communists. Also in Belgium, for instance, the first governments after the Second World War, I think for 1 year and a half, 2 years, there were coalition governments, so-called governments that wanted to bring all political ideologies together, and to bring political stability after that very destructive period of the Second World War, and was a government with Social Democrats, Christian Democrats, and also with communists. But after a while, with the increasing tensions between the East and the West, the communists were thrown out of the government and were not trusted anymore. But I think from 1945, 1946, in the majority of the European countries, the recovery, economic and political recovery, was built on coalitions between Social Democrats and Christian Democrats. And to a certain extent, this is still the same today. If you have a look at the organization of the European Parliament, for instance, the biggest groups, I think, still are the groups linked to the Social Democrats and linked to the Christian Democrats. With difference and similarities, I don't think this course is the best course or moment to explain the differences or the similarity between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats. I think what they shared was the ambition to increase purchasing power, material well-being, but also living standards, and to build a new welfare state in which the government played an important role also in helping the more poor social classes, in dividing, in fact, or sharing the new prosperity over all social classes. Yes. And I think that's what I wanted to say about this slide. With the Cold War, communists were thrown out of the government, coalitions of Social and Christian Democrats, and in Central and Eastern Europe, we see the opposite developments. Maybe one slide I can present to you this morning. Britain is a bit atypical, I think, because in Britain there was no real communist party. Had also to do with the fact that there was no communist resistance, of course, during the Second World War. And as I said before, after the Second World War, with the first elections, the Labour Party won the elections, remained into power until 1951, and for a lot of, no, I must correct myself, for all social democratic parties on the European continent. The Labour Party in that period was the big example and showed the way how to organize the economy and what kind of role the government could play in guiding the economy towards recovery. And what you saw, in fact, is that all Western European countries after the Second World War opted for a mixed economy, an economy that sought for an equilibrium between capitalism, but also state involvement. And that was not always that easy to find, but the Labour government in Britain, who had all the power, did not have the negative effects of a coalition government. The Labour Party guided or was a guiding example, you could say. Was Labour very much involved in the future of the European continent? Not really, you could say. As mentioned before, the British government looked first and foremost to its own colonial empire that witnessed a lot of challenges after the Second World War. In fact, you could say that Britain was bankrupt after the Second World War. It was already more or less bankrupt after the First World War, but it definitely was after the Second World War, and had to cope with huge challenges, had to manage its own economy on the British Isles, but how to manage the financial challenges, political challenges, organizational challenges of that huge colonial empire. You need money to do that, and Britain didn't have the money. And that's also one of the reasons for that, also because of the independence movements in the colonies, of course, but this resulted in that phase of independence. So that's why Britain focused on the problems linked to the empire, looked for economic possibilities towards its Commonwealth network, and also looked to the United States for collaboration and for help and support. And European continent, that was not top of their interest, so top of their mind. That's also one of the reasons why in the next decades Great Britain did not want to join European coal and steel community, did not want to join European economic community. And it was only in the course of the 1960s when it became more and more clear for British politicians that it was from an economic perspective much better to be part of that European economic integration, and that Britain changed their policy and wanted to become a member of the European Economic Community. But they still had to wait until the beginning of the 1970s to become a member of the European Economic Community. And so that's a bit for 20 years, more or less, was that in general, the British strategy towards European integration. Interesting, maybe on an intergovernmental level, but definitely not on a supranational level. Britain did not want to hand over sovereignty, autonomy to some kind of organization based in Strasbourg or in Brussels. And that would only change in the 1960s. And then after a while, leaving again European Economic Community. Okay, what can we say about Germany? Quickly, as I said before, under strict control of the occupying powers. In the beginning, there was an Allied Control Council. They bring in the four occupation powers together to organize, to manage Germany. But already soon, even at the end of the Second World War, there were big tensions, big differences regarding how to organize the new Germany. the Soviet Union wanted huge reparations. And they said, we have lost a lot of people, a lot of financial damage, and Germany has to pay it back. We need that for our economic recovery. In the West, the Americans, the British, to a lesser extent the French, they believed that this was wrong. The First World War and the Paris Versailles Treaty had proven that punishing Germany very harsh was not a way to bring back political stability on the European continent. So that was in the beginning a big frustration. And to make a long history short, this resulted in 1946 in the so-called Berlin blockade. And then in 1948, 1949, really, and according to a lot of political historians, this was, let's say, the real beginning of the Cold War. And what happened, in fact, the Soviet Union blocked all routes towards Berlin from the west. Berlin was an island in East Germany. Do not forget that. And so Soviet Union could block the overland transport routes from West Germany to Berlin. And the reaction of the Western world, you could say, of Britain, United States, and France was, in fact, to organize an airlift, and for many months, all kinds of consumer products, resources from clothes to coal to warm the houses were transported with airplanes from West Germany to the western part of Berlin, and also underlining that West Berlin must remain a part of the Western world, and that continued for decades, in fact, and you know that story until 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, which happened very suddenly in the end. Okay, but next to all these political tensions, I think most of the European citizens, they wanted a normal life. They wanted economic prosperity. They wanted a job. And the big question was how to organize this and what kind of international support and help could be set up to have a fast and a quick economic recovery of the European continent. And then we have to focus on the Marshall Plan. But the Marshall Plan was much more than an instrument to stimulate the economic recovery. It was also a way of bringing European countries together, to force them to work together, to look for more integration. And it was also a political and ideological instrument of the United States. And all these aspects are linked to that international recovery program, which we know today as the Marshall Plan. But the details of that I will explain to you next week. So I think it's the right moment now to stop. Don't be disappointed. We have worked very hard, I think, this morning. So thank you for the attention, for being here. If you have questions about the course, do not hesitate. Send me an email, ask me next week, whatever you want. And I hope to give you next week the date for the visit we will do to the House of European Integration. Okay? Have a nice day. Have a nice week. See.